Bitch, where's my money? If you want to help me out, you can subscribe to me on Patreon, which is Grimachu, on Subscribestar, which is Grim-Jim, or if you want to make a one-off donation to help support me and keep the channel going, you can do so at paypal.me/JDesborough. Thanks. Hello lovelies. Today we're going to take a look at the Goblin Slayer tabletop role-playing game, TRPG, to differentiate it from computer RPGs. This is based on the dark, gritty, humorous anime and manga by the same name that had some controversy a couple of years back. This is a dummy thick RPG book, 600 pages. Thankfully, not hardback, or as big as a lot of games have been getting, but still 600 pages. It's printed in the same sort of form factor as a lot of manga books, and the paper is the same kind of cheap, pulpy paper that is used on a lot of collected manga works as well, all of which kind of takes me back to the old Fighting Fantasy, the Dragon Warriors paperbacks. These are all good things in my book, though I have to say that I think the chonky form factor and the paper quality, this is not a book that is going to stand up to a lot of reference work. This is a book where you'll probably want to either catch a pirate copy as well on PDF for your laptop for reference, or the Kindle version. I think there's a Kindle version, or you're going to want to copy out a lot of the relevant tables and rules separately so that you don't destroy your book through referencing it. But it does make it cheap for what you get, which is a very nice thing to see. The form factor does have one other unfortunate side effect, in that the typeface on a lot of the pages is rather small, and the low contrast between the text and the paper colour is something I found difficult when combined with the small typeface when I was reading. But then I am practically blind without my glasses, and yeah, it was difficult with bifocals to read some of the sections. Much of the book isn't as such small type, and that's fine, that's readable okay, but where it does go small, it can be difficult and eye-straining to read. There's very little art in this book, and that felt like a very odd choice, given that it's coming from a highly visual medium, comics, manga, and that there was so much art that could have been called upon to illustrate examples and so on from the Goblin Slayer book. But instead, if I just open up a bunch of random pages, I mean, the industry standard is about one illustration every 3 pages or so. Yeah, we haven't seen any yet from me randomly leafing through, and we might expect to run into them more often. And the art that we do find typically isn't actually from the Goblin Slayer manga. So that was a bit of a confusing choice, but at 600 pages you can understand why they might have cut out art. Now this is actually properly, effectively translated from the Japanese tabletop role-playing game, the choice that the Dark Souls RPG people didn't make. That's far more interesting, I think, for an RPG collector, for an RPG designer, to be able to see a properly translated Japanese tabletop role-playing game. It's not something that happens often, and it's something I welcome, because the language barrier and the different culture in Japan around fandom and so on has created a very sort of different atmosphere for gaming. So that it's fascinating for that alone, and gives me hope if this is a success, and I think it might be a success given the popularity of Goblin Slayer, given the interest particularly in the OSR community about this game. I hope it sells really well for them and they go back and they look at other games. The only other Japanese RPG that I can think of that has had a proper translation was Tenra Bansha Zero, and a whole bunch of other stuff for that, or derived from Tenra Bansha Zero, was supposed to come out. But if I remember correctly, and I'm not sure that I am, the guy who was doing the translations and selling them turned out to be a bit of a dick and took forever and didn't get a lot of it done. So we've missed out on a lot of cool translations of things like Terror the Gunslinger that I think would do gangbusters over here. That's based on Tenra Bansha Zero. So there have been attempts in the past. They haven't necessarily succeeded particularly well, or have had problems for other reasons. If this does gangbusters, I am very hopeful that the Western translation company will go back and do other Japanese tabletop role-playing games translations, because I really, really, really want to see them. I'm fascinated as a designer and a fan of manga and anime and so on, to see something like that. I'm talking a lot around the book and I haven't really cracked it open that much to show you, but you can't really see anything inside and there's not a lot of artwork inside to show off, so a page through isn't necessarily particularly useful, except to show you how goddamn dense the thing is. It doesn't follow Western layout. One thing tends to flow into another without a break where you would have art. All of this can make it a challenging read. So it's quite dense, it's quite rules heavy, but not. The rules are actually fairly simple, but the presentation isn't necessarily that easy. It's quite crunchy, and it's presented in a very long-winded and hand-holdy way. So it seems to be assuming that you're probably going to be a new player. So it takes a lot of time to describe all the rules properly. Good if you are a new player or someone who has been interested in Goblin Slayer or similar manga or anime and wants to get into role-playing. So it's useful from that aspect, but a little bit frustrating if you're a veteran wanting to get a quick, rapid grasp of the book and how everything works. It is apparently derived from Sword World, which is a big, famous Japanese TTRPG. There is some translated material, fan-translated material for Sword Art available online. You can find the links on Reddit. I think they were still working last I looked. I can't remember when I last looked. But it's 2d6 based, because it used to be hard to get polyhedral dice in Japan. So that's had an interesting effect on their game design philosophy. It's a bit weird, the Japanese fans are known for being like collectors of things, so you'd think they'd all be dice goblins, and so polyhedrals wouldn't be a big problem, but apparently, at least in the past, it was a problem. So you roll 2d6, you add a bunch of stuff, you compare to a target number. If you get over the target number, you succeed. If you get under the target number, you fail. Double sixes are typically a crit, double ones are typically a failure. That's the core of the system. Combat is pretty deadly. The amount you roll, not the margin that you succeed by, determines additional effectiveness for any attacks that you make. You do the base damage of the weapon plus that minus any armor and so on. So armor ablates damage. That's how it works. It is quite possible with decent rolls to carve your way through enemies or to be rapidly stabbed to death yourself. The spellbook isn't enormous, but then in the manga, in the anime, spellbooks aren't particularly enormous. You tend to see the same spells used over and over. You get a certain number of uses per day, not a huge number. but you're not really locked into a class in the way that you might be in a lot of games. Classes aren't really classes. So when you go to make a roll, you roll your dice, you add your statistical bonus, then you add your class bonus. Classes are more like clusters of skills, and skills provide additional bonuses or access to special abilities, and run from beginner to legend, +1 to +5. You know, so that's it's a factor, but it doesn't override everything else. So you roll, then you add your stat, add your class, add your skill bonus if you've got one. Skills are in a kind of nebulous area, kind of between skills and feats in a lot of ways. They open up access to things and they provide extra bonuses, but you don't need them necessarily to be super effective at normal adventurous stuff like climbing and picking locks and all of that kind of stuff. Most characters can do that at least somewhat competently. So the class operates similar to a way it does in, for example, Barbarians of Lemuria, where it's a descriptor and you can multi-class extremely easily. They'll give you access to certain things, perhaps, like if you combine a fighter class with a spellcasting class, you'll be pretty handy with a sword and able to fire off the occasional spell. So you can pick and choose classes as you want, and they act more like catch-all skill bonuses and access to capabilities. That's pretty much it. It's hard to describe, but it's quite easy to grasp once you get into it. Stats are interesting because you have primary stats, like you normally might, and then you have secondary stats. So a primary stat might be strength, a secondary stat might be focus, and where the two intersect and add together, you have like a strength focus. So if you're trying to do a feat of strength where you need to focus and exert your strength, like rolling a boulder aside, you'd cross those two together, look on the grid, add them together, that's your base stat. Which is an interesting way of looking at things as well. This is what I mean about it being interesting to have a different approach to RPGs, a different lineage of RPGs, to look at some different ideas and things that I haven't necessarily seen elsewhere. So that's the system, that's the form factor and so on. Like I said, there's not a lot of point me leafing through the book with you. Background and story. Not much, considering. About a third of the book, I guess, is world setting, games master's advice, and monsters. So that's what you could call setting. The monsters is largely statistics, and GM's guide is just GM advice, like you already used to. So actually, we have under 100 pages of world background, and you're not going to get any new amazing revelations about the world from the comics in here. There are online wikis, or you can read the comics and the light novels if you want more in-depth background. But here it's pretty basic stuff. You do get to learn a bit more about the Adventurers Guild, the gods that exist within the world, the languages, but it's not, compared to the rules, it's not very dense, it's not very hand-holdy, but then it doesn't need to be. But you're not going to get any amazing revelations about the world from that, and what's presented is a fairly bog-standard fantasy world where the gods play dice with the fates of the characters, and that how those things work. It works. It's nothing special, but what did make Goblin Slayer special was right from the first episode, right from the first manga, it presented its world as being extremely nasty, brutal, dangerous, especially to low-level adventurers. Goblins are a challenge even if you're quite experienced, just through sheer numbers and so on. Does the game manage to replicate that experience? Yes. Does the game description and so on shy away from the nastier aspects of the world, such as struggle cuddles from little green guys and slavery and so on? No, it doesn't shy away from it. It has a passage that basically says these are the nasty elements in the world, you can take it or leave it, I guess, but it doesn't shy away from it. It just presents it as is. It spends some time talking about the nature of slavery and so on in the world. So I guess you couldn't sell this on DrivethruRPG, which is a shame. But if you're replicating the Goblin Slayer manga and anime, then you can't shy away from those things, can you? So that's good. The other main thing that I think it's succeeded in replicating from the anime and manga, and I don't know if this is a normal thing from Sword World, but exhaustion, tiredness, these are things you constantly have to be aware of. So on your sheet, let's see if I can open this out without destroying it, which I doubt. Okay, I couldn't really fold it out in a way that you could see, but what you have is you have a track, and as you engage in combat or other strenuous activity, then you tick off points on this track, and as that gets higher you start raising your exhaustion, and exhaustion is broken down into different levels, and you start taking penalties to the things that you do, and eventually you can become so exhausted that you die. So that encourages tactical play. It plays into the darker, grittier side of the anime and the manga that it's based on. That's interesting. That's a rule that people might want to steal. Okay, so scores. Style-wise, there's virtually no art. The way in which it is laid out flows into itself without the natural breaks that art and chapter breaks and so on have necessarily in other tabletop RPGs. There's not a great deal of information proportionally on the game world. Even the monsters don't have pictures, which is kind of annoying, or that much in the way of background. I mean, you can get all this stuff from online wikis or from reading the manga, so I guess it's not too drastic, but in a game book, in a source book, you kind of want more information. And the aspect ratio is a curiosity and what I'm not against, but the low contrast, the small typeface in certain sections, these are all problems when it comes to style. I can't really justify giving it a particularly high score in terms of style. A high 2 perhaps in terms of style. It's not welcomingly presented in terms of its graphic design, even though its verbiage is quite welcoming. And there's not enough information on the world and the background and so on, and there's virtually no art. So style 2. In terms of substance as well, I mean, the vast and overwhelming majority is the rule system, and that's normal to a degree, but I mean, it is overwhelming. Nearly 400 out of 600 pages are rule system, and so the content on the game world and the monsters is somewhat lacking, in terms of substance as well as in terms of style. So, but then again, it's 600 pages, and it's a more accessible, portable form factor and price. Even so, I can't give it more than a high 3 in terms of substance. So that's only 5 out of 10. 2.5 out of 5. That's bang on average score. But my scores don't take into account that this is a collectible and a curiosity, and it's fascinating from a Western manga fan perspective, and from a game designer's perspective, and I think from a gamer's perspective. And when you combine the game book with the surrounding material, the manga, the light novels, the anime, as a whole, it becomes worth a lot more. Now, this is the score just for the book itself. So I still think it's a worthwhile buy at $20 US as a curiosity for game designers, and to encourage the future translation of additional Japanese RPGs that we have otherwise missed out upon. And if you're a game designer, if you're in the OSR, I think it's worth picking up for inspiration and ideas and a peek into that Japanese lineage of tabletop role-playing games. So even though it's a low score, I still recommend it. I still want to play it. That score is looking at this just as a game in and of itself, without the surrounding material. And so the lack of art, the lack of background, the technical manual presentation, these are all things that drag it down. But in spite of all that, I think it's worth a punt and worth a play. Zang, cease thy goblinry.
Rob Necronomicon's art has graced several Postmortem Studios products, and Rob has also produced some stock art pieces you can use in your own projects or at your gaming table. Rob's stark, dark graphical style is perfect for horror, old school fantasy, and dark future projects. You can buy Rob's art from Postmortem Studios at DrivethruRPG or at post-mort.com.